Alina Vasquez was not supposed to be here. She was a translator, a junior worker who carried papers and stayed quiet in corners. Her job was to be invisible, to listen, and to never speak unless someone important needed a word explained. But the universe had other plans. 3 hours ago, the shuttle carrying the human ambassadors had suffered a terrible failure. Something in the engines had broken apart. The ship was now floating dead in space, waiting for rescue. The ambassadors were safe, but stuck. They would not reach the station for another 2 days. Alina had been traveling on a different ship, a small transport vessel that was bringing supplies and minor staff to the summit. She had arrived on time. The ambassadors had not. This meant that Alina Vasquez, a 32-year-old translator from a small city on Earth, was now the only human on Kethvora Station. And today was the most important day in galactic history. The Galactic Concord had kept peace for 11,000 years. 3 great civilizations had built it together. They had ended wars, shared knowledge, and lifted each other toward the stars. It was the greatest alliance the universe had ever known, and it was about to fall. Alina stood in the observation gallery above the main chamber. Through the transparent floor, she could see the 3 delegations taking their positions below. Her heart was beating so fast that she could feel it in her throat. The Valkyrie came first. They were beautiful and terrifying. Their bodies were made of living crystal, and they moved like music given physical form. Light passed through them and scattered into rainbows. They communicated through sounds that were more like songs than words. Their memories were perfect. They could recall events from thousands of years ago as clearly as yesterday. To them, humans were infants. Interesting, perhaps, but barely worth noticing. The Thressen arrived next. They looked like insects, but that description did not capture what they truly were. Each Thressen body was not a single being. It was a piece of something much larger. The Thressen Collective was a hive mind, billions of bodies sharing one consciousness. They did not understand the concept of self. They had never experienced loneliness or disagreement. Every Thressen was the collective, and the collective was every Thressen. When they spoke, millions of voices spoke together. Finally, the Arati entered. They were massive reptilian creatures covered in scales that looked like armor. Their eyes were cold, and their movements were deliberate and dangerous. The Arati were warriors. Their entire culture was built on codes of combat and honor. They respected strength and despised weakness. To them, talking was something you did before fighting, not instead of it. These 3 species had built the Concord together. For 11,000 years, they had maintained peace. But 1 week ago, everything had changed. A Valkyrie research vessel had been destroyed near the border of Thressen space. The ship had been studying ancient stars. There were no weapons on board. No soldiers. Just scientists doing their work. When rescue ships arrive, they found only debris. And in that debris, they found evidence. Weapon signatures. Energy patterns that matched Arati military technology. The Valkyrie demanded answers. The Arati denied everything. The Thressen, whose space sat between the other 2 empires, began preparing for the war that would certainly tear through their territory. Each species blamed the others. Each species had positioned their war fleets at the borders. Thousands of ships carrying weapons that could burn entire planets. Billions of lives hanging on what happened in this chamber today. Alina had studied these 3 species for 15 years. She had learned their languages, their histories, their ways of thinking. She had always believed that understanding was the key to peace, that if people could just communicate, they could solve anything. Now she was not so sure. She watched the 3 high speakers take their places in the chamber below. The Valkyrie representative was ancient, her crystal body showing patterns of age that Alina could barely read. The Thressen speaker was not a single body but a cluster of 12, all moving in perfect unison. The Arati speaker was the largest of his kind that Alina had ever seen, his scales scarred from countless battles. The translation systems activated. Alina listened carefully as the first words were spoken, and then she felt her blood go cold. The Valkyrie. High Speaker began with a formal statement of grief. Her harmonics were a mourning song, a beautiful expression of sorrow for the lives lost. It was not an accusation. It was an invitation to share in sadness before discussing what had happened. But that was not what the others heard. Alina watched the Thressen collective react. Their bodies moved in agitation. The translation system had converted the Velkari harmonics into something else entirely. What the Thressen heard was not grief. It was a demand. A claim that the collective was responsible. An ultimatum. The Arati heard something different still. To their ears, shaped by a culture of warriors, the morning song sounded like a war chant. A declaration that blood would answer blood. Alina pressed her hands against the observation window. Her mind was racing. This was not a problem of evidence or politics. This was not about who had destroyed the ship or why. This was something far more fundamental. They could not understand each other. These three species had been allies for 11,000 years, and they had never truly communicated. They had simply never disagreed about anything important enough to reveal the flaw in their translation systems. The technology converted words, but it could not convert meaning. It could not bridge the vast gap between how each species thought. The Velkari processed reality through perfect memory and harmonic resonance. The Thressen understood existence as collective consciousness, where individual action was meaningless. The Arati saw the universe through the lens of combat and honor. They were speaking to each other, but they were having three completely different conversations. Alina looked at the countdown display on the wall. The summit had a time limit. Ancient law required that all parties declare their intentions within 6 hours. If no agreement was reached, the default position was assumed. The default position was war. 6 hours. 3 species who could not hear each other. Fleets waiting at the borders, and 1 human translator standing alone in the observation gallery, watching everything fall apart. Alina closed her eyes. She thought about Earth, about her small apartment, about her mother, who had always said that Alina talked too much, about all the years she had spent learning, languages that most humans would never hear. Then she opened her eyes and walked toward the door that led down to the chamber. She had no authority, no power, no right to speak, but she was the only one who could hear what was really being said, and she could not stand by and watch the galaxy burn. The guards at the chamber door did not know what to do with her. Alina stood before 2 Arati warriors, each one twice her size. Their scales gleamed under the station lights. Their eyes studied her like she was a small animal that had wandered into the wrong place. She explained what she wanted. She used their language, speaking the harsh sounds as clearly as she could. She wanted to address the Concord. She was invoking her right as a representative of a member species. The guards looked at each other. One of them made a sound that might have been a laugh. Humans had only been granted standing in the Concord 30 years ago. It was a minor thing at the time. A courtesy given to a young species that had just learned to travel between stars. Humanity was barely a footnote in galactic records. They had no fleet worth mentioning, no ancient history, no power. But the law was the law. Any species with standing could request voice in the chamber. The guards could not refuse her. They stepped aside. Alina walked into the chamber. The effect was immediate. Every being in the room turned to look at her. The Velkari High Speaker's harmonics shifted to frequencies of confusion. Humans lived for such a short time. Why would one of them wish to speak before beings who remembered the birth of stars? The Thressen collective buzzed with activity. Millions of minds working together, trying to understand why a single node would separate from its hive to act alone. In their experience, individual action was a sign of malfunction. A healthy mind did not disagree with itself. The Arati simply stared. To them, Alina was prey. Soft, small, weak. What could she possibly offer to warriors? Alina walked to the speaker's circle in the center of the chamber. The floor beneath her feet was made of some material she did not recognize. It was warm and seemed almost alive. Above her, the dome's ceiling showed the stars outside. She was surrounded by beings who could destroy her world without even noticing. She had never been so afraid in her life, but she had also never been so certain that she needed to. Speak. She bowed to each delegation in turn. Using the proper forms she had studied for years, the Valkyrie received a harmonic acknowledgement that her translator device produced. The Thressen received a gesture that recognized them as a unified whole. The Arati received a warrior's greeting that acknowledged their strength. Without challenging it, then she spoke. She did not argue. She did not present evidence. She did not try to solve the mystery of the destroyed ship. Instead, she asked a question. She turned to the Thressen collective first. In their clicking, buzzing language, she asked them a simple thing. What had they heard the Valkyrie say in their opening statement? The collective answered, they had heard an accusation, a claim that the collective had destroyed the ship, a demand for immediate confession and surrender. Alina nodded. She turned to the Valkyrie. What had they actually said? The High Speaker's harmonics filled the chamber. She had expressed grief, sorrow for the lost lives. She had invited the other species to share in mourning before any discussion of blame. The Thressen collective went silent. All 12 bodies in their speaker cluster stopped moving at exactly the same moment. Alina continued. She turned to the Arati. What had they heard in the Valkyrie statement? The Arati High Speaker answered in his grinding voice. He had heard a war chant, a declaration that the Valkyrie would seek blood vengeance, a threat that their fleets would strike first. Alina turned back to the Valkyrie. Had they said anything about war or vengeance? The High Speaker's crystal body flickered with distressed colors. No. She had spoken only of grief, only of sorrow. There had been no mention of war. Now, Alina turned to the Valkyrie. What had they heard when the Thressen responded to their opening statement? The High Speaker answered. The Thressen had claimed innocence, but offered no proof. They had suggested that the Arati were the obvious culprits. Alina asked the Thressen what they had actually said. The collective answered slowly, as if they were having trouble processing what was happening. They had expressed their own grief. They had said that the loss of any life diminished the universe. They had not mentioned the Arati at all. The chamber had grown very quiet. Alina asked more questions. Each answer revealed the same terrible truth. Every statement made by one species was being heard differently by the other two. Not just misunderstood, completely transformed, the Arathi's formal promise to investigate. The attack had been heard by the Thressen as a threat of imminent invasion. The Thressen's offer of assistance had been heard by the Arati as an insult to their honor. The Valkyrie's request for patience had been heard by both other species as a demand for immediate surrender. 11,000 years? 3 species had been allies for 11,000 years. They had fought wars together. They had built wonders together. They had created the greatest peace the galaxy had ever known. And they had never once truly understood each other. Alina explained what she believed had happened. The translation systems worked on words, but words were not meaning. Each species thought in fundamentally different ways. The Valkyrie processed reality through memory and music. The Thressen could not even imagine individual thought. The Arati filtered everything through concepts of combat and honor. For 11,000 years, this had not mattered. The 3 species had agreed on the big things. Their alliance worked because they wanted the same outcomes, even if they understood those outcomes differently. But now they disagreed. Now they were afraid. Now they were angry. And for the first time, the flaws in their communication were visible. The Valkyrie High Speaker moved forward. Her harmonics were complex, layered with emotions that Alina could barely identify. She asked how this was possible. How could such a flaw have existed for so long without being discovered? Alina answered honestly. She did not know. Perhaps it was luck. Perhaps the Concord's founders had been wise enough to build structures that avoided conflict. Perhaps the universe had simply been kind, but now the kindness had run out. Now they were facing a crisis that required true understanding, and they did not have it. The Arati High Speaker made a sound of frustration. What good did this knowledge do them? Knowing that they could not understand each other did not change the fact that a ship had been destroyed. Lives had been lost. Someone was responsible, Alina agreed. The question of responsibility still remained. But now they knew something important. They knew that they could not trust their own interpretation of what the others said. They needed a bridge. They needed someone who could translate not just words, but meaning. The three high speakers looked at her. Alina felt the weight of their attention. The weight of 3 civilizations. The weight of billions of lives. She was a translator. It was the only thing she had ever been good at. And right now, it was the only thing that mattered. She straightened her shoulders and prepared for the hardest work of her life. The next 18 hours were the hardest of Alina's life. She did not sit down. She did not eat. She barely remembered to drink water when one of the station attendants pressed a container into her hands. Every moment, every second, she was translating. But this was not normal translation. This was something far more difficult. She was not just converting words from one language to another. She was converting entire ways of thinking. The Valkyrie spoke first about their investigation of the destroyed ship. They had studied the debris carefully. Their perfect memories had recorded every detail. They presented their findings in layers of harmonic patterns, each frequency carrying different information. Alina listened. Then she turned to the Thressen and explained what the Valkyrie had said. But she did not just repeat the words. She rebuilt the entire concept. The Valkyrie did not understand suspicion. Their memories were perfect, so they could not imagine why any being would hide the truth or have secret motives. When they looked at evidence, they saw only facts. They did not see possible deception. Alina had to explain this to the Thressen in a way they could understand. She described it as a system that had no error checking, a process that assumed all inputs were accurate. The Thressen understood systems. They understood processes. This translation made sense to them. Then the Thressen responded. They shared their own analysis of the attack. But they spoke as a collective, using concepts that assumed all thoughts were shared. They said things like, "We knew," and "we felt," without explaining which part of the collective had the information, or how it had spread. Alina turned to the Arati and translated. But the Arati could not understand collective consciousness. To them, each being was individual. Each warrior stood alone. So Alina explained the Thressen response using military terms. She described the collective as an army where every soldier shared the same orders instantly, where no one could keep secrets from command. The Arati understood armies. This made sense to them. The Arati then offered their own findings. They spoke of honor and insult, of challenges and responses. Their investigation had been guided by warrior codes that the other species could not comprehend. Alina translated this for the Valkyrie as a kind of music. She described the Arati codes as a complex song where each note demanded a specific response, where every action was part of a larger pattern that had to remain in balance. The Valkyrie thought in music. This reached them. Hour after hour, Alina stood in the center of the chamber. Her throat grew dry. Her legs ached. Her mind felt like it was stretching in directions it had never gone before. 3 times, she made mistakes. The first mistake almost ended everything. She translated an Arati phrase incorrectly, making it sound like they were claiming the Valkyrie had destroyed their own ship. The Valkyrie high speaker's harmonics shifted to dangerous frequencies. Alina caught her error and corrected it immediately, explaining that she had failed to account for a double meaning in the Arati warrior codes. The moment passed, but her hands were shaking. The second mistake came when she tried to explain individual choice to the Thressen. She used the word malfunction to describe a person acting alone. The collective took this as an insult to their entire nature. Alina had to spend 20 minutes carefully rebuilding their trust, explaining that human language had limits that she was struggling to overcome. The third mistake was the worst. She accidentally implied that the Arati believed the Thressen were cowards. In Arati culture, this was an unforgivable insult. The high speaker rose to his full height and demanded satisfaction through combat. Alina had to invoke an ancient Arati law about protected speakers to save herself. It took an hour to calm everyone down, but through all of this, something else was happening. Alina was not just translating. She was listening, really listening, taking in every detail, every piece of evidence, every fragment of information that the three species were sharing, and slowly, a picture was forming in her mind. She started asking questions during the translation. Small questions that seemed like they were just for clarification. What type of energy had destroyed the ship? Where exactly had the debris been found? What was the radiation level in that region of space? The answers came, and Alina processed them while continuing to translate. Her brain was working on two tracks at once. One track focused on bridging the gap between species. The other track was solving a puzzle. Something was wrong with the evidence. The weapon signatures found at the attack site matched Arati military technology. That was clear. But Alina remembered something from her studies. Arati weapons used a specific type of energy discharge. That discharge was affected by certain types of radiation. She asked about the stars near the attack site. The Valkyrie answered readily. Their research vessel had been studying old, dying stars. Stars that produced very specific types of radiation. Alina did some calculations in her head. She was not a scientist, but she understood basic physics. The numbers did not work. Arati weapons could not have functioned in that region of space. The radiation from those dying stars would have disabled the weapons before they could fire. The energy signatures would have dispersed. The attack could not have happened the way the evidence suggested. Someone had placed that evidence there. Alina stopped translating. The three high speakers looked at her with confusion. She had never paused before. She asked for permission to share something. Something that was not a translation, but an observation. Permission was granted. Alina explained what she had realized. She walked through the physics, translating each concept for each species as she went. The Valkyrie confirmed the radiation levels. The Thressen confirmed the energy dispersal patterns. The Arati confirmed that their weapons could not function. Under those conditions, the chamber grew very quiet. Again, the Arati did not destroy that ship. The evidence had been placed there to make it look like they had someone wanted this war. Someone had killed those Valkyrie scientists and made it look like the Arati were responsible. Someone was trying to tear the Concorde apart. For the first time since the summit began, all three species were looking in the same direction. They were looking at Alina, and they were waiting for her to tell them what to do next. Alina presented her findings carefully. She was not an expert. She was not a scientist or a detective. She was just a translator who had listened closely and noticed something that did not fit, but that was enough. The three high speakers ordered their technical teams to review the evidence again. This time, they worked together. Valkyrie memory specialists recalled every detail of the attack site. Thressen computation nodes processed the physics. Arati weapon experts confirmed what their technology could and could not do. The answer came back within an hour. Alina was right. The evidence had been placed there. The attack could not have happened the way they originally believed. The Arati high speaker rose from his seat. His scales seemed darker now, his eyes harder. Alina had learned to read his expressions over the past hours. She knew what this look meant. He was angry, but not at the other species. He was angry at whoever had tried to use his people as a weapon against their oldest allies. The question now was simple. If the Arati did not destroy the ship, who did? The Valkyrie high speaker moved to the center of the chamber. Her crystal body caught the light in new patterns. She asked for silence while she searched her perfect memory. The attack had left traces. Not just physical evidence, but harmonic patterns. Energy signatures that did not match any known weapon type. At the time, they had assumed these were side effects of the explosion, echoes, interference. But now she looked at them differently. These patterns did not match any species in the Concorde. They did not match any species that Valkyrie had ever encountered. The chamber absorbed this information. The Thressen Collective began processing at full speed. Millions of minds working together on a single question. Who else was out there? Alina watched and listened. She continued to translate as needed, but her role had shifted. She was no longer the only bridge. The three species were now working together directly, using her techniques to check their understanding of each other. The Thressen Collective reached a conclusion first. They had been analyzing communication records between the three species. Thousands of years of diplomatic messages, treaties, and agreements. They found something disturbing. Small errors in the translation systems. Tiny mistakes that changed the meaning of certain words. Not enough to cause immediate problems, but enough to plant seeds of distrust over time. These errors had been introduced gradually. One small change every few years. So slow that no one noticed. So subtle that they seemed like natural drift in the translation algorithms. But they were not natural. They were deliberate. Someone had been manipulating the communication between the three species for over a century. The Arati High Speaker demanded to know who. His voice was a growl that shook the walls. He wanted a target. He wanted an enemy to fight. Alina understood his frustration. But she had realized something that the others had not yet seen. The enemy had planned this carefully. They had studied the Velkari and learned their patterns of thought. They had analyzed the Thressen Collective and understood how the hive mind worked. They had observed the Arati and knew exactly how to provoke them. They had done this for over a century, maybe longer. Watching, learning, waiting for the right moment to strike. And in all that time, they had never paid any attention to humanity. Alina thought about this. Humans had been traveling between stars for only 50 years. They had been members of the Concord for only 30. They were young, weak, and seemingly unimportant. They had no ancient wisdom like the Velkari. No collective power like the Thressen. No military might like the Arati. They were easy to ignore, and that was exactly why the enemy had made a mistake. The enemy had modeled the three great species perfectly. They knew how the Velkari would react to evidence of aggression. They knew how the Thressen would calculate probability and prepare for war. They knew how the Arati warrior code would demand immediate response. They had created a perfect trap. Every piece was in place. Every reaction was predicted. But they had not accounted for a translator. They had not imagined that a single human would be in the right place at the right time. They had not considered that someone would ask the simple question, "What did you actually hear?" They had overlooked humanity because humanity did not matter. And that oversight had ruined everything. Alina shared this observation with the three high speakers. She explained it carefully, making sure each species understood what she was saying. The Velkari high speaker considered this. Her harmonics shifted to thoughtful frequencies. She asked what made humans capable of this. Why could they bridge gaps that the other species could not? Alina thought about it. The answer was not flattering to humanity. It was not heroic. Humans were good at understanding different perspectives because they had to be. Human history was full of conflict. Different groups with different beliefs, different languages, different ways of seeing the world. Humans had spent their entire existence trying to understand people who thought nothing like them. They were not good at it because they were special. They were good at it because they had practiced for thousands of years. Every war, every peace treaty, every failed negotiation and successful compromise. Every marriage between people from different cultures. Every child who learned to understand a parent who saw the world differently. Humans were good at this because they had always been terrible at it. And they had never had the luxury of giving up. The Arati high speaker made a sound that Alina had never heard from his species before. It took her a moment to recognize it. He was laughing, not with mockery. With something like respect. Humans were soft and weak. Yes, but they had a strength that his people had never considered. They knew how to survive when understanding failed. The Thressen Collective spoke next. They had reached a decision through their shared consciousness. The enemy had ignored humanity. The enemy had considered them unimportant. The enemy had built a perfect plan that accounted for every variable except one. The enemy had been arrogant, and arrogance, the collective noted, was always a weakness. The summit had changed. It was no longer about preventing war between the three species. It was about finding whoever had tried to start that war. Alina looked at the countdown display. Only 2 hours remained. But the atmosphere in the chamber was completely different now. Three ancient civilizations were no longer facing each other as enemies. They were standing together, facing the darkness, searching for whatever hid within it, and somehow, against all probability, a single human had helped them get here. The message went out to the fleets at the borders. Stand. Bound. 3 words in a dozen languages. 3 words that stopped the largest military forces in the galaxy from beginning a war that would have burned across 1,000 worlds. The Valkyrie fleet had been the first to move. Their ships were beautiful things, crystalline structures that sang as they traveled through space. Now they turned away from the border and began the long journey home. The Thresson fleet followed, millions of vessels moving in perfect coordination, each one a piece of the collective's body. They had been ready to sacrifice everything to protect the whole. Now they retreated, buzzing with relief and confusion in equal measure. The Arati fleet was the last. Their ships were weapons, pure and simple, designed for war and nothing else. The crews had been eager for battle. Standing down was not easy for warriors, but honor demanded that they follow the High Speaker's command. And so they, too, turned away from the brink. Alina watched from the observation gallery, the same place where she had stood when the summit began. She was exhausted. Her body ached. Her mind felt stretched beyond its limits. But she was also filled with a strange, quiet joy. She had done something. Something that mattered. Something that would ripple across the galaxy. For centuries to come, the Concord's final declaration had surprised everyone. The 3 High Speakers had deliberated for less than an hour before reaching agreement. For the first time in 11,000 years, they had discussed an issue while truly understanding each other. They had used Elena's techniques, checking each interpretation, clarifying each concept. The process was slower, more difficult, but it worked. Their decision was unprecedented. Humanity was elevated from provisional standing to full recognition. This was unusual, but not shocking. Species earned full standing through contributions to the Concord. But they went further. Humans were formally requested to serve as the Concord's primary diplomatic corps. Not one human, not a team of specialists. The entire species was invited to train as translators, as bridges between civilizations. The reasoning was clear. The enemy had exposed a flaw in the Concord. For 11,000 years, the 3 great species had been allies who did not truly communicate. They had built something wonderful on a foundation of mutual misunderstanding. That foundation needed to be rebuilt, and humans were uniquely qualified for the job. Alina did not know how humanity would respond to this invitation. She was just a translator. She had no authority to speak for her species, but she hoped they would accept. The galaxy needed bridges, and humans had been building bridges between different minds for as long as they had existed. She was still standing in the observation gallery when the Valkyrie High Speaker found her. The ancient being moved like music. Her crystal body refracted the starlight into patterns that Alina found beautiful but could not interpret. She'd spent years studying Valkyrie language, but their visual communication was still beyond her. The High Speaker stopped beside Alina. Together, they looked out at the stars. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the High Speaker's harmonics filled the air. Elena's translator device rendered them as words. "We have studied your species," the High Speaker said. "You are fragile. You live brief lives. Your world contains thousands of languages, endless conflicts, divisions we cannot understand. How do you survive?" Alina considered the question. She thought about human history, the wars, the peace treaties, the families torn apart by misunderstanding, and the relationships healed by patience. The constant struggle to find common ground with people who saw everything differently. "Because we've had a lot of practice," she said finally. "Every human has to learn to understand people who think nothing like them. We do it every day, just to get through life. We're not good at it because we're special. We're good at it because we've always been terrible at it, and we've never had the luxury of giving up." The High Speaker processed this. New harmonics entered her song. Elena's translator struggled to find a word for the emotion, eventually settling on something like beautiful sadness. Perhaps the high speaker said, "That is why the enemy feared you enough to ignore you." Alina had not thought about it that way. But the words resonated with something inside her. The enemy, whoever they were, had been watching the galaxy for a very long time. They had studied the great powers and learned their weaknesses. They had built a perfect trap, designed to turn allies against each other, but they had dismissed humanity. A species too young, too weak, too chaotic to matter. They had not understood that chaos was not weakness. Division was not failure. The endless struggle to bridge differences was not a flaw. In human nature, it was humanity's greatest strength. Somewhere in the darkness between stars, Lena knew the enemy was watching. They had seen their perfect plan fall apart. They had seen 3 ancient civilizations step back from the brink of war, and they had seen a single human stand in the center of it all. Armed with nothing but the ability to ask the right questions, they would not underestimate. Humanity again, Alina smiled slightly at that thought. Let them come. Let them try again. The galaxy was not as divided as it had seemed. The Concord was not as weak as they had hoped, and humanity was not as insignificant as they had believed. She turned away from the window. There was work to do. Real translation work, the difficult kind that built understanding one conversation at a time. The high speakers wanted to begin immediately. They wanted to learn from humanity's experience with bridging different minds. Alina was tired. She wanted to sleep for a week. She wanted to go home and never think about galactic politics again. But she was also a translator. And this was what translators did. They built bridges. They connected different worlds. They stood in the space between and helped both sides understand each other. The galaxy had underestimated many things about humanity. They had assumed that a short lifespan meant limited wisdom. They had assumed that internal conflict meant weakness. They had assumed that chaos was the opposite of strength. They were wrong. Humanity's chaos was practice. Every argument resolved, every difference bridged, every moment of connection across the gap of misunderstanding. Thousands of years of training for exactly this moment. Alina walked back toward the chamber. The high speakers were waiting, and somewhere in the dark, the enemy was learning a lesson that would reshape their understanding of the galaxy. Humans were not to be ignored, not anymore.